Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. It was early November when I agreed to house sit for a couple I barely knew. They were friends of a friend, retired teachers who'd left for Phoenix to visit family for a few weeks. The place was about 15 minutes outside Flagstaff, down a narrow forest road lined with ponderosa pines so tall they seemed to bend in the wind. Their house was small but well kept. Wood siding, a sloped metal roof, and a long gravel driveway that crunched loud enough under my tires to echo. There were no other houses in sight. No lights through the trees, no sound except the wind and the occasional creak of the tall pines shifting. It felt peaceful at first, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you can breathe again. They'd left me a list of instructions, a note about feeding the cat, watering a few plants, and where to find the spare firewood stacked in the shed out back. They mentioned that sometimes elk came through the yard at night, and I might hear them bumping against the fence or scraping their antlers against the trees. I didn't think much of it. The first night went fine. I watched a movie, fed the cat, and fell asleep on the couch around midnight. The house was older, but the heating worked well. I remember the smell of pine and smoke from the wood stove, mixing with the faint scent of the couple's laundry detergent. It gave the place a lived-in, comfortable feeling. The second night changed everything. It was around 10:30. I was sitting on the couch, the TV low, half watching some nature documentary while scrolling through my phone. Outside, the wind had picked up. You could hear it hissing softly through the gaps in the trees, making the porch steps creak now and then. I'd noticed that when the wind blew hard enough, it sometimes made the screen door rattle. But that night, the wind had died down completely. It was just still and cold. Then I heard it. 3 sharp knocks on the window directly behind the couch. Not a random thump or a branch scraping the glass. 3 distinct, deliberate knocks. I froze. It's strange how quickly your brain starts trying to make sense of something like that. My first thought was maybe an animal, though it didn't sound like an animal. Then maybe someone was lost, or a car had broken down on the road. But even as I thought it, I knew how far away the nearest road was. The gravel driveway alone was long enough that headlights would have shone through the trees if anyone had driven up. I turned slowly to look, my heart pounding in my throat. The blinds were half open, and the only thing visible was my own reflection faintly shining in the glass. No face, no figure, nothing. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out. The porch light reached only partway into the yard, and beyond that, it was total darkness. The trees looked like tall black pillars against a moonless sky. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it must have been a branch, maybe something shifting in the wind. I checked the lock on the front door, double-checked the one on the back, and turned on the outside lights. Nothing moved out there. The cold night air that slipped in when I cracked the door open felt sharp enough to sting. I went to bed after midnight, telling myself to forget it. I left a small lamp on in the hallway just for comfort. The cat had curled up at the end of the bed, asleep, and I eventually drifted off too. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard the sound, wood creaking softly, one step at a time, from the hallway just outside the bedroom. The kind of sound old floorboards make when someone's weight shifts on them. I held my breath. The cat was awake now too, sitting upright and staring toward the door. I could see the shape of its head, its ears tilted forward. I didn't move. I just listened. The sound came again, slow, measured, like someone was deliberately trying not to make noise, but couldn't help the boards giving away. My hand fumbled for my phone on the nightstand. The couple had mentioned that they'd installed motion-activated security cameras around the house. One over the porch, one in the driveway, and one in the hallway. I opened the app they'd left logged in for me. It took a second to load. When it did, I saw nothing. Each camera showed the same message. No motion detected. That didn't make sense. I was hearing movement right outside the room. I switched between the live feeds again. Porch, clear. Driveway, clear. Hallway, nothing. The hallway camera was supposed to cover the very spot where I was hearing those steps. That's when I noticed the small light blinking faintly on the screen. It wasn't the camera feed. It was an icon in the corner that showed whether the device was connected. It was flashing red. Disconnected. I sat there staring at that blinking red light, realizing what it meant. The hallway camera had been unplugged. Something inside me went cold. I didn't move for what felt like forever. The sounds had stopped by then, but the house felt alive in a way it hadn't before, like someone else was breathing in it. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. The cat leapt off the bed and disappeared under the dresser, silent. I didn't try to check the hallway. I didn't even look toward the door. I just waited until the first bit of gray light started to show through the blinds. When I was sure it was morning, I got up, packed my bag in silence, grabbed my keys, and left. When I stepped outside, the air hit me like ice. The ground was damp, the car covered in frost. I looked around once more before getting in. The front porch light was still on, flickering slightly like it had been left on all night. The side of the house where the window was faced the trees, and even in daylight it looked strange. Too shadowed, too quiet. As I drove down the long gravel driveway, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the porch. But no one did. I didn't tell the owners exactly what happened. I just said everything was fine, and that I had to leave early for work. They thanked me and said they'd be home the following week. I didn't mention the knocks, the creaking floorboards, or the camera. A week later, they messaged me. The tone of the message was casual, but something about it made my skin crawl. They said someone had broken into the garage. Nothing was taken, but a few things had been moved around. They couldn't figure out how the person had gotten in, since the door hadn't been forced. They said it must have been some kids messing around. I didn't respond right away. I just stared at the message, remembering the blinking red light on that camera, the sound of those slow, careful footsteps, the way the cat had stared toward the hallway like it could see something I couldn't. I thought about how deliberate those knocks had been. 3 quick raps on the glass like a signal. Someone testing. Someone who already knew there was only one person inside. Someone who might have been close enough to see my reflection when I turned around. For a long time after, I kept replaying the sound in my head. The steady rhythm, the silence afterward. I realized whoever had been there that night hadn't come to steal anything. They hadn't broken a window or forced a door. They'd walked close enough to touch the glass and knock, just to see what I'd do. They'd watched long enough to know where the cameras were, and when I finally locked the door and went to bed, thinking it was over, they were already inside. When I was 14, my dad rented a farmhouse outside Bloomington. It sat at the end of a long gravel road that wound past bare trees and half-collapsed barns. The place looked old but sturdy, white paint chipping off the siding, porch boards warped from years of rain, and a tall windmill that creaked at night when the wind picked up. Behind the house was a wide, empty field. In November, it was nothing but flat earth and dead corn stalks, gray and brittle, reaching out to the horizon like a sea of dry bones. The soil was hard and cracked, and when the wind blew, the stalks rattled together with a dry, papery sound that reminded me of whispers. The farmhouse had that smell old houses have: dust, cold wood, and something faintly metallic. My room was upstairs, facing the back field. The first few weeks there were quiet. My dad worked long hours at a warehouse in town, and I'd usually sit at the window at night doing homework or reading while the wind slid around the corners of the house. Out there in the distance there was nothing. No houses, no traffic, no lights. Just the occasional red blink of a plane crossing high above. It was late November, just before Thanksgiving, when I noticed the first lights. I remember that night clearly because the air felt strange, heavy but still, like everything had stopped moving. It was past 11 and I couldn't sleep. I looked out the window and saw something faint near the horizon. At first I thought it was lightning, a dull flicker low to the ground, but it didn't fade. It moved, slowly, like a handheld light swinging side to side. Then I saw another one, maybe 100 feet away from the first, moving the same way. They weren't car headlights. There was no road back there. It was just field all the way to a line of trees maybe half a mile off. The lights drifted along that space, low and steady, as if someone was walking with lanterns. I watched for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The two lights stopped at one point and then both turned at the same time, facing a different direction, like they were searching for something. After a few minutes, they went out completely. The next morning, I told my dad about it. He shrugged and said it was probably hunters or kids from town messing around. The way he said it made it sound like it didn't matter, so I tried not to think about it. But over the next few nights, I kept seeing them. Sometimes there were 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. Always moving slow, spread out evenly, never random. They'd glide across the field, stop, then turn together like they were working in formation. The movement was too precise to be kids playing. One night I stayed up late just to watch. The moon was thin and high, barely lighting the field. Around midnight, the lights appeared again, 4 this time. They started near the far edge, moving toward the center. I pressed my face to the window glass and watched. The lights would stop for several seconds, then shift direction, always staying the same distance apart. I remember feeling my heart beating fast even though nothing was really happening. There was just something wrong about how they moved. Too slow, too careful, too deliberate. After a while, they stopped completely and stayed still for maybe 5 minutes. Then one by one they went out, just gone like someone had covered them. The field looked darker than before. I stared for a long time, trying to see movement, but there was nothing. The next morning, my dad went out there. He didn't tell me he was going. I just saw him from the kitchen window, walking through the backyard in his boots with his hands in his jacket pockets. He went all the way out, past where the corn ended, until he looked small against the horizon. When he came back, his face was pale and he didn't say much. I asked him if he saw anything. He said it was nothing, just an animal probably. But later that day, when I went out to the barn to grab some firewood, I saw his boots by the door. The soles were covered in mud, but there were dark streaks up the sides like he had stepped in something wet that wasn't just dirt. He didn't go out there again after that. I noticed him keeping the back door locked at night, even though we never used to. He also started pulling the curtains closed in the kitchen once it got dark. He'd never been the type to worry about things like that. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. It was late afternoon, cold and gray, and I decided to walk out there myself. The field was quiet except for the wind moving the stalks. The soil was uneven, cracked in places, and frozen near the surface. I walked out maybe 200 yards before I saw something strange. A patch of flattened stalks, circular, maybe 6 or 7 feet across. The ground there looked darker. When I got closer, I realized it was a large blood stain, but the soil around it was dry. No footprints, no drag marks, no sign of struggle. Just a dark, soaked patch that looked old. That night I didn't see any lights, or the next night. But a week later I woke up to a sound. It was faint, a metallic clink like something striking metal out in the field. It happened again, then again, evenly spaced. I pushed open the curtain and there they were, the lights. 4 of them again, perfectly spaced, moving slower than ever, almost as if they were dragging something. I watched for nearly an hour. My window started to fog up from my breath, and I remember wiping it clean again and again just to keep watching. Then suddenly, all 4 lights stopped. They stayed still for a long time, longer than usual. I could see the faint outlines of their glow shimmering against the low mist that had started to form. And then one light turned, pointing directly toward the house. The other 3 followed one by one, until they were all facing me. The lights didn't move closer. They just stayed like that, watching or whatever they were doing. After a minute, they blinked out all at once. The next morning, I didn't tell my dad. I knew he wouldn't say anything I wanted to hear. But later that afternoon, I noticed something new near the edge of the field. Vultures. Maybe half a dozen of them circling above one area, then landing. I waited until my dad left for town. Then I went out there again. I found the carcass not far from where I'd seen the dark patch before. It was a deer, but it looked wrong. The body was intact, no torn flesh, no bite marks, but it was gutted clean. The inside was hollowed out like it had been drained. There was no blood on the ground, none on the fur, just that empty cavity. I stood there for a long time staring at it and felt my stomach twist. It wasn't something an animal did. It looked more like a butcher's work, neat, precise, deliberate. When Dad came home, he saw me outside and told me to go in. He walked out to the field again, stayed there for a while, and when he came back, he looked worse than before. He didn't say what he saw, just told me not to go out there anymore. That night he double-checked every lock in the house. He didn't eat dinner, just sat in the living room with the TV on but the volume low, staring at nothing. We stayed through the winter, but things never felt the same. I stopped looking out the window at night. Some part of me felt like those lights were still out there, waiting. Sometimes I'd wake up and think I saw a faint glow far out past the tree line, but I never got up to check. By the time spring came, the field had gone green again. The windmill stopped creaking as much, and everything seemed a little more normal. Then one morning, Dad told me to start packing. He said we were moving before summer. No explanation, just that he'd found a place closer to town. I didn't argue. Years later, when I was older, I brought it up once. He didn't want to talk about it. He just said he found something else out there the day after the deer. I asked what it was, and he told me to drop it. He never went into detail, but I could tell it still bothered him. Sometimes when I think back to that winter, I still see those faint lights in my head, moving in perfect sync, silent across that wide, dead field. Whatever they were looking for out there, I don't think they ever stopped. It was the first real snow of the season, the kind that falls in big, slow flakes and seems to mute the entire city. The streets downtown were empty that night, slick with ice. The sidewalks dusted white. I was volunteering at the winter shelter on 9th and Madison, a converted church basement that smelled faintly of coffee, disinfectant, and wet boots. We'd opened 2 weeks earlier, but this was the first night the temperature had dropped below freezing. The kind of cold that burned your skin if you stayed outside too long. I'd been on shift since 6 p.m., checking people in, handing out blankets, making coffee, trying to keep things calm. The shelter could hold about 40 people, but we had closer to 60 that night. Cots lined every wall, and still, some people slept sitting up in folding chairs. The air was heavy with body heat, coughs, and the sound of rustling plastic bags. There was a faint draft from the stairwell that made the back of the room colder than the rest. But people didn't complain. It was better than the street. Sometime after midnight, the door rattled. I remember because the sound was sharp. 3 quick knocks that cut through the low hum of the place. I opened it and a man stepped inside. He wasn't old, maybe mid-40s, but his face looked worn down, like someone who'd lived too long outside. His coat was torn across one shoulder, dirty and stiff with frost. He had no gloves, and his hands were shaking so hard I could hear his knuckles clicking together. He didn't give a name, just said he needed to get warm. His voice was rough and low, the kind that comes from sleeping outdoors in the cold too many nights. I nodded and waved him in. He walked past me without another word and sat in a folding chair near the far corner, right next to the old radiator that barely worked. For a long time, he just sat there, hunched forward, hands near his mouth staring straight at the exit door. I brought him a blanket and a paper cup of coffee, set them beside him. He didn't move for a while. When he finally reached for the cup, his sleeve slid back and I saw blood. At first I thought it was his. Dark stains down the inside of his arm, thick near the wrist. I asked if he was hurt, if he needed medical help. He looked up at me then, slow, eyes dull and bloodshot, and said quietly, "Not mine." That stopped me cold. There was no emotion in his voice, no anger, no fear, just those 2 words, flat and final. He looked away again, back toward the door, and I stood there for a moment not knowing what to do. There was a rule about calling paramedics for visible injuries, but his expression made me hesitate. He didn't look dangerous exactly, just hollow, like someone completely emptied out. I decided to keep an eye on him. I went back to my rounds. refilling coffee urns, picking up trash, checking on the people sleeping. Every time I looked over, he was still awake, still staring toward the exit. The radiator hissed quietly beside him, but he never moved closer to it. Around 2 a.m., the lights dimmed for quiet hours. A few of us stayed up to watch the room, and I remember glancing back toward that corner maybe 10 or 15 minutes later, and he was asleep. Head tilted back against the wall, mouth slightly open, one hand hanging loosely off the chair. The coffee cup was on the floor beside him, half full and cold. I felt relieved. I figured maybe he'd finally warmed up enough to rest. It must have been another hour before I checked again. I don't remember what made me notice first, the empty chair or the cup knocked over. He was gone, just gone. The door at the top of the basement stairs was still locked from the inside. No windows down there opened wide enough for anyone to slip through. Nobody had seen him leave. I checked the restrooms, the storage room, even behind the stack of cots in the back corner. Nothing. It didn't make sense, but I didn't push it. Sometimes people came and went quietly, and I was too tired to chase a mystery in the middle of the night. By morning, the snow outside had built up into heavy drifts along the curbs. The street was silent, pale light reflecting off the frozen asphalt. The first bus of volunteers came in around 7, and we started cleaning up, folding blankets, waking people. I was wiping down tables near the entrance when 2 police officers walked in. They were bundled up tight, their breath showing in the cold air. They asked if we'd seen anyone come in last night. A man, about mid-40s, dark hair, thin, wearing a torn brown coat. I told them yes, he'd been here. I asked why they were looking for him. One of them said a man matching that description had been found behind a diner 2 blocks away, frozen, face down in the snow. Dead. I felt my chest tighten. I asked when they found him, and one of the officers said the body had been there since the night before. That didn't make sense. I told them he'd walked into our shelter after midnight, that he'd been sitting right there, alive, drinking coffee, that he'd talked to me. They looked at each other, then back at me. The diner was on 11th and Madison, 2 blocks away, and according to them, the man had been discovered around 6 a.m., but the medical examiner estimated he'd died sometime between 10 and 11 the previous night. They thanked me for the information, said they'd be in touch if they needed a statement. I remember just standing there after they left, holding a rag in my hand, staring at the corner where he'd sat. The chair was still there, a faint rust-colored stain on the armrest that hadn't been there before. I didn't mention it to anyone. Later that day, I walked over to the diner. The alley behind it was narrow, piled with snow pushed aside by plows. The wind cut straight through my jacket. There were still faint tire tracks and police tape fluttering near the dumpsters. I could see the dark mark in the snow where they'd found him. The spot looked smaller than I expected. That image wouldn't leave my head. The way he'd sat there staring at the door like he was waiting for something. I replayed it over and over, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was wrong about the time. Maybe he'd left earlier than I thought and gone out into the cold again. People did strange things when they were in distress. Maybe he'd wandered off and collapsed. Maybe the body they found wasn't him, though the coat sounded identical. Still, the details lined up too perfectly. The torn shoulder, the blood, the same corner of downtown. The next few nights at the shelter felt heavier. Every time the door opened, I half expected to see him again. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said when I'd asked about the blood. Not mine. A week later, one of the other volunteers told me they'd heard more from the police. The blood on the man's coat hadn't been his. They'd matched it to another individual, a homeless man found stabbed in an alley off 10th Street earlier that same night. They thought the man in the coat might have been a witness, or maybe he'd tried to help. No one knew. That night, when I closed up, I sat for a while in the same chair he'd used. The radiator rattled beside me. The room was empty, quiet except for the hum of the furnace. The snow outside kept falling, soft and steady, covering the city again. I tried to picture what had happened. Maybe he'd come across the other man, tried to help, got blood on him, panicked. Maybe he'd been running from something. Maybe he'd made it as far as our shelter, before realizing he couldn't escape the cold or whatever memory he was carrying. Maybe that's why he couldn't stop staring at the door, because part of him was still out there, waiting for the night to end. When I left the shelter that morning, the air was sharp and dry, the kind that cuts your throat when you breathe too deeply. The snow had stopped and the city looked quiet, almost clean. I pulled my coat tight and walked past the diner on my way to the bus stop. Someone had shoveled the alley clear, but I could still see the faint outline in the snow, melting slower than the rest. I stood there for a minute, watching it, my breath hanging in the cold air, and I thought about how he'd looked when he came in. Eyes red from the wind, hands shaking, voice low. He just wanted to get warm. That was all, just a few hours out of the cold, and I realized then that maybe what unsettled me most wasn't the mystery of how he'd vanished, or how the timelines didn't match. It was how ordinary it all felt. How easily someone could appear out of nowhere, sit quietly among us for a few hours, and then be gone, leaving nothing behind but a chair, a stain, and a question that never really goes away. I still volunteer there every winter. The radiator in that corner still rattles. The chair's been replaced, but sometimes late at night I catch myself glancing toward that spot, expecting to see someone sitting there again, waiting for the warmth to reach them. It never does. The air there always feels just a little colder. Ron lived directly behind me, on the lot that backed up to my fence. His house was old and a little run down, a single-story ranch with a sagging porch and a yard full of tall, dried grass. He'd been there longer than anyone else on the block, from what I was told. Retired, mid-60s maybe, white hair cut short, always in the same faded green jacket no matter the season. He never really went anywhere. I'd see him sitting on his porch most days, smoking cigarettes and drinking from a can of beer, just staring out at the yard like he was waiting for something. He never bothered anyone, but he also didn't talk to anyone. That fall, he started building something in his backyard. At first, I thought it was just a storage shed. Everyone in the neighborhood assumed the same thing. There were stacks of lumber leaning against the fence, a few bags of cement, and a new flood lamp mounted on a tall pole that pointed straight down into the space he was working in. The light was bright enough that it spilled over the top of my fence and through my kitchen window every night. He'd work late, way later than made sense for a man his age. I'd see the shadows of him moving around under that harsh white light, sometimes even close to midnight. The sound of his hammering carried through the still November air, dull and slow. It had a rhythm to it that made it impossible to ignore. Sometimes I'd get up to get a glass of water and see him still out there, head down, working in the cold with his jacket zipped up to his neck. One night, I remember standing by the window for longer than usual, just watching. The ground was frosty, and I could see his breath in the air. He was dragging something across the dirt, something long and heavy. He moved it to the far corner of the shed, where the light didn't quite reach. I couldn't tell what it was, just that it didn't look like wood. He crouched for a while, doing something I couldn't make out. Then he stood still for a long time before heading inside and shutting off the light. A week or so later, the shed was finished. I could see the shape of it clearly from my yard now, smaller than I expected, with no windows and a thick, heavy-looking door secured with a padlock. The siding was the same faded color as his house, but the boards looked newer, cleaner. He'd built it in the far corner of his lot, almost up against the tree line that separated his property from the woods behind us. After that, I figured it was done. But then the light came back on again. It started one night around 10. I noticed it through my blinds, that same bright white glow flooding into my kitchen. It stayed on all night. The next morning I looked out and didn't see Ron anywhere. Usually he was on his porch by 8 or 9, cigarette in hand, same seat every day. That morning the chair was empty. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he'd gone somewhere, though that thought didn't fit him. By the second day the light was still on. I went out into my backyard, stood by the fence and listened. Nothing. The wind was cold and the air smelled faintly of burnt wood from someone's fireplace down the block. I waited for a minute, expecting to hear his cough or the creak of his porch steps. Nothing. On the third night, the light was still on, and I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the thought that something had happened to him. His mailbox was full, and his trash bins hadn't been moved from the curb. The flood lamp burned steadily, buzzing faintly. The beam cast long shadows through the thin branches at the back of his yard. By the fourth day, I called the sheriff's office. It wasn't an emergency, but I explained that my neighbor hadn't been seen all week, and the light in his backyard had been on nonstop. They said they'd send someone to check. When the patrol car pulled up later that afternoon, I watched from my kitchen window. The deputy walked up to the front door, knocked a few times, then circled around back. I couldn't see much from where I was, just the top of his flashlight beam moving behind the fence. Then a second car arrived. Another deputy got out. They both went around the back together. I saw them stop, and one of them radioed something in. After a few minutes, one of them came back to my yard gate and told me to stay inside. His voice was calm but flat, like he was trying not to let anything slip. He didn't answer when I asked if Ron was okay. Later that evening, more cars showed up. An unmarked one and a coroner's van. The light in the backyard was finally shut off. I didn't find out what had happened until the next morning, when a neighbor a few houses down told me what she'd heard from one of the deputies she knew. Ron had died in his house, apparently from a heart attack a few days before I'd even called. They found him inside, sitting in a chair like he'd just stopped moving mid-thought. But that wasn't the part that unsettled everyone. The shed, the one he'd spent all those nights building, wasn't just a storage space. Inside was a mattress, blankets, a small propane heater, and boxes of food stacked neatly against the wall. There was a portable toilet, water jugs, even a small battery-powered radio. It looked like someone could live there comfortably for weeks. But what caught the deputies off guard were the chains. 4 thick steel chains were bolted into the walls, spaced apart, each ending with a heavy cuff large enough to fit around an ankle or wrist. They were brand new, still shining under the flashlight beams. Nothing about them looked improvised. Each bolt was perfectly aligned, anchored into the studs. There were faint scuff marks on the floor near them, like someone had dragged the chains around testing their range. The strange part was that everything else in the shed suggested comfort and care. Blankets folded neatly, food sealed and organized, heater positioned in the center. Whoever it was meant for, it wasn't for Ron. He wouldn't have needed to chain himself inside. No one could figure out what he was planning. There wasn't any record of him having family or visitors. No car ever came or went. His phone was disconnected. But the shed had been built with precision, almost obsession. The receipts for the materials were all dated within the last 2 months, all bought locally. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about that light, how it had stayed on all week, shining into the darkness while he lay dead inside the house. It meant the flood lamp was wired separately, left on intentionally. Maybe he'd turned it on that last night for a reason. Maybe he'd been expecting someone. When they finally took the shed apart, I saw the inside for the first time. They removed the door and loaded the panels onto a flatbed. From my window, I could see the outlines on the walls where the chains had been. Deep circular impressions from the bolts. The dirt floor underneath was smooth. No footprints but theirs. After that, the property sat empty for months. No one wanted it. The light pole was gone, and the yard grew over with tall brown weeds. On quiet nights when the air was still, I could still picture the way the light had spilled across my kitchen tiles, that harsh white glow that made it hard to sleep. Sometimes I catch myself staring out that same window around the same time. Like habit. I know the shed's gone. I know he's gone. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever he built it for, whoever he built it for, never made it there. Or maybe they did, and just left before anyone noticed. Every now and then I still dream about that backyard. The light always comes back on. It hums quietly in the cold air, steady and white, casting shadows that move even when there's no one left to cast them. It was one of those long, overnight Greyhound rides that blur together after a few hours. The kind where the air smells faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee, and everyone's half asleep. trying to pretend they aren't sharing the same cramped air for 8 hours. It was early November, the first real cold snap of the season, and Denver had already seen flurries that day. I remember sitting in the terminal before departure, watching people drift in under the yellow lights, faces pale from the cold, clutching duffel bags and paper cups of gas station coffee. My ticket said I'd be arriving in Albuquerque around 7 in the morning. I figured I'd get some rest on the way, but sleep on a bus like that never really comes. I got the window seat, left side near the middle. There were maybe 15 people total, scattered throughout. A mother with a little boy sat a few rows ahead. An older man in a cowboy hat near the back. A couple of teenagers sharing earbuds. The guy who took the seat beside me looked to be in his mid-30s, unshaven, eyes hollowed from lack of sleep, wearing a navy puffer jacket that looked one size too big. He didn't say anything, just nodded when he sat down. He carried no backpack, no phone in his hand, nothing visible except a folded bus ticket sticking out of his jacket pocket. I figured he was just another traveler between jobs or homes, the kind who sleeps through everything. We pulled out of Denver a few minutes after 10. The driver gave the usual talk. Seatbelts, bathroom in the back, no smoking, no alcohol, and the cabin lights dimmed. Outside, the city lights gave way to dark open fields, a few distant farmhouses glowing in the night. I leaned against the window, watching the faint reflection of my face flicker with the passing lights, feeling that quiet stillness that settles in once everyone stops talking. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was steady, hypnotic. The man beside me barely moved. Once or twice I glanced over and saw him with his hands clasped together in his lap, eyes open, just staring ahead. His breathing was slow and even, like someone deep in thought. At one point, maybe around Pueblo, I noticed him shift slightly and press his forehead against the seat in front of him, like he wasn't feeling well. I thought about asking if he was okay, but something about his stillness felt too private, like I'd be intruding. By midnight, the bus was quiet. A few snores, the occasional cough, the hum of the heater blowing dry, warm air from the vents. My window was cold to the touch, and condensation had gathered in the corners. I must have dozed off for a while because the next thing I remember was the bus slowing down, pulling into a gas station parking lot in Trinidad. The driver's voice came over the speaker saying we'd have a 15-minute break. The fluorescent lights outside were harsh, flickering on cracked pavement. A few people got up, stretching, grabbing their jackets. I stayed seated for a bit, groggy, debating whether to get off. The guy next to me stood up suddenly without a word and walked toward the front. He moved stiffly, almost robotic, his hands still clasped in front of him. I watched him step off the bus, into the cold white light of the gas station lot. When I finally decided to go grab something to drink, I noticed he was standing near the edge of the lot, a few yards from the convenience store, staring off into the darkness beyond the pumps. I thought maybe he was just catching some air. It was cold enough that I could see his breath. He didn't move, didn't smoke, didn't even put his hands in his pockets. Just stood there. I went inside, bought a bottle of water, and when I came back out, I didn't see him anymore. Everyone reboarded a few minutes later. The driver stood by the door, counting passengers as they came in. I found my seat again, the one by the window. The man's seat beside me was empty. I figured he might have decided to skip the rest of the ride. Or maybe he'd switched buses. It happens sometimes. People just don't come back. The driver's head count must have matched because he closed the door and started the engine. The bus rolled back onto the highway, headlights cutting through the dark. I stretched out a bit, glad to have the extra space. I remember checking my phone, 12:47 a.m., before tucking it away and closing my eyes. The rhythmic sway of the bus and the hum of the road made it easy to drift in and out of shallow sleep. I woke up later to the faintest sound. At first I thought it was someone's headphones leaking noise, or maybe a kid whispering to a parent. But it wasn't words, it was slow, measured breathing. Too close. Not coming from the front or the back, but right behind me. I stayed still, pretending to sleep, trying to convince myself it was just someone leaning forward or shifting in their seat.
The sound went on for several minutes.
Inhale, exhale. Calm, deliberate. I could almost feel the air move against my neck when the person exhaled. Finally, I turned my head slightly, pretending to adjust my jacket, just enough to glance back. My heart jumped hard in my chest. Sitting directly behind me was the man who had been next to me earlier, the one who hadn't gotten back on the bus. His jacket collar was turned up, his head slightly bowed. His hands were clasped again, resting on his knees. His lips were cracked and dark, and in the dim overhead light, I could see something glistening around his mouth. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. My mind tried to explain it. Maybe he got back on and I just hadn't noticed. Maybe the driver had miscounted earlier, but I knew I'd watched him walk off and I'd never seen him return. Everyone else on the bus was asleep. I could see their silhouettes slumped over, faces pressed against windows. No one else seemed to notice him sitting there. I turned back toward the front, heart pounding. I told myself not to make a scene, not to panic. The bus was in the middle of nowhere, highway stretching endlessly in both directions. I just had to wait until the next stop. The breathing behind me didn't stop, though. Every few minutes it would go quiet for a while, then start again, slower this time, heavier, like someone struggling to stay awake. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the sound of the tires, the faint vibration of the floor beneath my feet, the occasional flicker of passing headlights outside. At some point I must have fallen asleep again despite it all. When I opened my eyes, gray light was filtering in through the windows. The sky outside was just beginning to pale, a thin line of dawn on the horizon. We were rolling into Albuquerque. The bus slowed as it approached the terminal, the engine downshifting with a low groan. My neck was stiff and my mouth tasted dry. I looked to my left, out the window, and then glanced back, part of me hoping absurdly that the man behind me would be gone. He wasn't. He was still sitting there, in the same position. Head bowed, hands clasped, face turned slightly toward the aisle. But now I could see it more clearly. The dried streaks of blood around his mouth, a faint red stain on the collar of his jacket. His eyes were half open, glassy, fixed on nothing. No one else seemed to notice him right away. The bus came to a stop. The driver turned on the lights and people started to gather their things. The mother and her kid shuffled past me. The older man in the cowboy hat stood up and stretched, and the two teenagers yawned and unplugged their earbuds. I waited for the man behind me to move, to stand, to do anything, but he didn't. As the bus emptied out, the driver came down the aisle, doing his routine check. He stopped near the back, muttering to himself, then turned toward my row. He reached out to tap the man on the shoulder. Nothing. Another tap. Still nothing. The driver leaned down slightly, then jerked back, face pale. He said something under his breath and quickly stepped out of the aisle. I could see from where I sat that the man's skin had gone pale and waxy, his lips blue, eyes open but lifeless. A few people nearby realized what was happening. There was a low murmur, some confused whispering. Someone called 911. The driver asked everyone to stay put until the police arrived. I sat frozen, staring at the seat in front of me, trying to process what I had seen. It took about 15 minutes for the police and EMTs to show up. They boarded quietly, spoke with the driver, then made their way down the aisle. They checked the man for a pulse, asked a few passengers questions. I told one of them that he'd been sitting next to me when we left Denver, that he'd gotten off at Trinidad and hadn't come back until later, though I didn't see how. They wrote that down, but one of them looked at me strangely, like he wasn't sure if I was tired or just mistaken. Eventually, they cleared everyone off the bus. I stood outside on the cold pavement of the Albuquerque terminal, watching them zip the man's body into a black bag. The driver stood nearby, rubbing his temples, muttering about how the head count had matched when they left Trinidad. He swore it did. Later, as the police went through the man's pockets, they found his Greyhound ticket. I overheard one of the officers say it was stamped for a trip from Denver to Albuquerque, but dated 2 nights earlier. Not the night before, 2 nights ago, meaning he'd already missed that ride. There was no other ID on him. No wallet, no phone, nothing else. Just the ticket crumpled with the ink slightly smudged. They took statements from a few of us, asked about when we'd last seen him alive. I told them again that I saw him standing at the edge of the gas station lot, staring into the dark. One of the officers nodded, said something about maybe he'd walked off somewhere and collapsed later, and someone else brought him back thinking he belonged on our bus. But no one at the gas station remembered seeing anyone help him back aboard. The security cameras apparently weren't working that night. When they finally let us go, the sun had fully risen. The terminal lot was filled with the dull morning light that makes everything look washed out. The air was cold and smelled faintly of diesel. The driver stood near the door smoking a cigarette, looking shaken. I grabbed my bag, still trying to shake the image of that man sitting behind me. Breathing slow and heavy in the dark, blood on his mouth, eyes empty. I caught a cab from the terminal to my hotel downtown. The driver had the news on the radio, some local story about road closures up near Santa Fe. I stared out the window the whole time, barely hearing it. When I got to the hotel room, I locked the door and sat on the bed for a long time, just listening to the hum of the air conditioner. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment when I'd woken up and heard the breathing behind me. How close it had been, how I'd felt the air move. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face in the dim bus light, the stillness of his hands, the faint sound of that breath. I kept wondering how someone could just disappear and then reappear like that, unnoticed in such a small space. There weren't that many of us on the bus. Someone should have seen him come back. A few days later, I checked the local news online, expecting maybe some update about the man. There wasn't much, just a short article. Passenger found deceased on Greyhound bus. No name released. Police investigating possible medical cause. No foul play suspected. That's all it said. But every time I think about that night, what sticks with me isn't just the shock or the unease. It's that slow, deliberate breathing I heard behind me in the dark. The sound that woke me up. The kind of sound someone makes when they're still alive. The doctors said he'd been dead for several hours before the bus reached Albuquerque. Long before the sun came up. Long before I ever turned around. And that part, the time between midnight and dawn, is what keeps me awake even now. It was early November when I lost my job in Portland. The company had been cutting staff for months, and when it finally came to me, it didn't even feel like a surprise. They handed me a check, cleared my desk, and I walked out into the wet, gray parking lot without any idea of what to do next. I'd been living paycheck to paycheck, and Portland rent wasn't cheap. I sold what I could, packed up my little Honda Civic, and decided to drive cross-country to stay with my cousin in Ohio until I figured things out. I wasn't in a hurry. I didn't have much left to lose, so I drove slow, taking smaller highways instead of interstates. Gas was cheaper outside the cities, and I stayed in cheap motels to save money. Places where the carpet smelled like damp cardboard and the lights flickered when you turned them on. I told myself it was temporary, just a few nights on the road. But by the time I reached Yakima, Washington, I'd already been sleeping in those kinds of places for nearly a week. It was late in the afternoon when I pulled into town. The sun was going down early, that flat golden light you get in November fading behind the hills. My windshield was streaked with dried bugs and dust, and the wipers squeaked when I turned them on. I'd been on the road since morning and my eyes burned. I just wanted a bed. That's when I saw the Valley Inn. The sign buzzed faintly, half the letters unlit, so it read more like Va-A Inn. There was a flickering vacancy sign in the window, and a few cars parked outside. Old sedans, pickup trucks, nothing that looked like it belonged to a family on vacation. It wasn't the kind of place you chose unless you had to. The office smelled like coffee and mildew. The guy behind the counter didn't look up when I came in, just asked for ID and said, $49 for the night. I slid my card over, he swiped it, and handed me a key with a heavy blue tag. Room 16. The hallway was narrow and smelled like bleach mixed with cigarette smoke. The carpet was worn flat in the center and sticky near the edges. The room itself looked like every other cheap motel I'd stayed in. off-white walls, yellow light from a single bulb, a TV bolted to a dresser that hummed even when it was off. The heater rattled when I turned it on, but only blew out lukewarm air. I sat on the bed, which sagged in the middle, and stared at the stains on the ceiling. I could hear the faint hum of traffic from the highway, and, underneath that, the sound of plumbing from other rooms, water rushing, then stopping. Tried to tell myself it wasn't so bad. I'd had worse. Around 10, I went out to the car to grab my duffel bag. The parking lot was empty except for a truck near the end, and a single light flickering near the office. It was cold enough that my breath came out in clouds. I could smell the sharp bite of burning wood from somewhere down the street. When I got back inside, the heater was still struggling. I put on a sweatshirt, brushed my teeth, and lay down. The sheets were scratchy, like they'd been washed too many times in cheap detergent. I left the bathroom light on because the main light switch was too far from the bed, and the room was too quiet without that little bit of glow. I was half asleep when I first heard it. A soft, muffled sound through the wall. I thought it was the TV in the next room, but it wasn't rhythmic like dialogue. It was uneven, broken. It took me a few seconds to realize it sounded like someone crying. It went on for a while. Quiet, shaky sobs, sometimes a little louder, then back to whispers. I sat up, listening. The sound was definitely coming from next door. Room 15. I checked my phone. It was just past midnight. I thought about calling the front desk, but the noise stopped suddenly. There was a long pause, and then came a thump. A heavy, solid noise like someone falling. Then silence. I waited for more. Voices, movement, something. But nothing came. Just that humming from the heater and the faint whistle of wind outside. My stomach tightened. I told myself it wasn't my business. People got drunk, argued, fell. Motels like this had all kinds of guests. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then I heard footsteps, slow, steady ones right outside my door. Not hurried or panicked, just measured. The kind of steps someone takes when they're trying to be quiet but not sneaky. The sound came closer, stopped for a second, then started again. Turned off the light. The heater kept humming. I got up carefully, heart pounding, and went to the window. The blinds were cheap aluminum, the kind that rattle when you move them. I pushed one aside just enough to look out. There she was. A woman, stood barefoot in the cold, maybe 30 feet from my door. Her hair was long and wet, hanging in clumps that stuck to her face. She wore a thin shirt and dark pants. No coat, no shoes. Her skin looked pale under the yellow parking lot light, and her lips had that dull blue color you see on people who've been in the cold too long. She was staring directly at my door, not moving, not swaying, just standing there, eyes fixed on the door like she was waiting for it to open. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still. She didn't move for what felt like forever. 2 minutes, maybe more. Then finally she turned and started walking toward the office, her bare feet silent on the pavement. She disappeared behind the corner of the building, and I didn't see her again. I stood there for another few minutes, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, but I hadn't. The imprint of her face, those hollow eyes, that soaked hair, was burned into my mind. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. A creak, a step, the heater clicking, and jolt awake again. Around 3, I thought I heard someone outside again, but when I looked, the lot was empty. At dawn, I gave up on sleep entirely. The air in the room felt stale, heavy, like it hadn't been open to the outside in weeks. I showered quickly, packed my things, and left. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that never really brightens. My car's windshield was crusted with frost. When I went into the office to check out, the same guy from the night before was there. He looked half asleep, sipping coffee and flipping through a stack of papers. I slid the key across the counter and hesitated. I didn't plan on saying anything, but the words came out anyway. "Hey," I said, "you might want to check on whoever's in room 15. I heard Something last night." He looked up then, frowned, and tilted his head. 15? He said. "We don't rent that one out anymore." I just stared at him. He pointed toward the hallway. "That room's been closed for a while. Water damage. You must have heard something from outside." I didn't answer. I just nodded, muttered thanks, and walked out. But I couldn't shake it. The sound of the sobbing, the thump, the woman in the cold. None of it lined up. I got into my car and started the engine. The heater blew foggy air for a while before warming up. I sat there looking at the motel through the windshield. The curtains in room 15 were drawn tight, same as they had been the night before. No light, no movement. As I pulled out of the lot, I noticed something I hadn't the night before. Behind the building, past the chain-link fence, there was a narrow service road leading to a small maintenance shed. And near the shed, the ground was torn up. A patch of dirt that looked freshly disturbed, darker than the rest, like someone had recently dug and refilled it. I drove off, trying not to think about it. But the more miles I put between myself and Yakima, the more uneasy I felt. My brain kept replaying it. The image of her standing there barefoot, staring at my door. The sound of that thump. That night I stopped in another town and checked into another cheap motel. I couldn't help myself. I looked around, checking the walls, the carpet, the parking lot. I tried to tell myself it was just noise, that maybe she was someone passing through, that the man at the desk was telling the truth about the water damage. But it didn't explain her clothes being soaked. It didn't explain the sound of someone crying from a room that wasn't supposed to be occupied. Few days later, when I finally made it to my cousin's place in Ohio, I still couldn't stop thinking about it. Out of curiosity, I searched Valley Inn Yakima on my phone. The place came up right away. Old Google reviews, most from years back, all mentioning the same things. Dirty rooms, rude staff, strange noises at night. One review caught my attention. It was dated from 2019, about 6 years earlier. The review said, "Stayed in room 15, never again. Heard someone crying all night through the wall, but front desk said no one was next to me. In the morning, saw police cars outside. Clark wouldn't tell me what happened." Another said, "Weird place. Someone knocked on our door after midnight, barefoot woman soaking wet, asked if we'd seen her boyfriend. When I went to get help, she was gone." The hairs on my arms stood up. I clicked deeper, scrolling through forums, old articles, anything that mentioned the Valley Inn. That's when I found a short local news piece from 2017. A body had been found behind the motel near a maintenance shed. The victim was a woman, mid-30s, last seen leaving a nearby bar. They suspected foul play, but the case was never solved. The article mentioned the motel's name, the Valley Inn. I stared at my phone for a long time, reading and rereading the paragraph. It didn't say her name, but it didn't have to. I knew. Every little detail lined up. The soaked hair, the bare feet, the way she stared at the door like she was trying to find someone, or waiting for someone who never came back. It wasn't supernatural, not in the way you'd expect. It was just real life. Something awful that had happened and left a mark that didn't fade, even when the room was cleaned, even when they stopped renting it out. I didn't tell anyone about it, not my cousin, not my friends. It wasn't the kind of story people believe when you say it out loud. They'd just tell me I was tired, or that I dreamed it, or that I read too many weird stories online. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and I see a flickering motel sign off the highway, I think about that woman standing in the cold. I think about how quiet she was, how she didn't knock or shout, how she just stood there, staring at my door like she was remembering something. And I think about that sound I heard before she appeared. The crying. The thump. The silence after. I tell myself it was all coincidence. That maybe the noise came from somewhere else. That maybe the woman was just someone lost. Someone with nowhere else to go. But deep down, I know better. There's something about places like that. cheap motels at the edge of town, half empty, full of people trying to disappear. Things happen there that never make it into the news, and even when they do, no one remembers for long. But the walls remember, the floors remember, and sometimes, if you're unlucky, you hear it too. The last time I checked, the Valley Inn was still listed online. Still $40 a night. Still there on the same stretch of road outside Yakima. The same cracked parking lot. The same flickering sign. Room 15 is still listed as under renovation. I don't think they're ever going to fix it. I grew up around hunters. Every November, the men in my family would load up their trucks with rifles, orange vests, and enough beer to last a week in the cold woods. I never went with them. I always said I was too busy or that I didn't like the cold. But the truth was, the idea of sitting out in the middle of nowhere waiting for something to walk by never sounded fun to me. Still, that year my cousin Matt invited me to stay at his cabin near Ashland, Maine, for a few days before the whitetail season started. He said it'd be good to get out of the city for a while. I agreed, thinking maybe I needed that kind of quiet. The drive up took hours. The last 30 miles were dirt roads, mud frozen into hard ridges, the trees closing in on both sides. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already down. It was small, made of dark wood with a metal chimney pipe sticking out from the side. The windows glowed orange from a propane lantern inside. The air was sharp and cold, probably in the low 20s, and the smell of pine needles and damp earth mixed with the faint diesel odor of Matt's generator running out back. Inside, it was warm enough from the wood stove. Matt had already been there a few days, scouting the area and checking trail cameras. There were deer racks on the wall, a few old photos of him and my uncle posing with bucks they'd shot in the past, and a line of rifles leaning against the corner by the door. The floor creaked. The air felt heavy with wood smoke and oil from the lanterns. The first night was uneventful. We cooked canned chili on the stove, and after a few beers, Matt went out to use the outhouse before bed. I remember how silent it was when he stepped outside. The wind had died, and all I could hear was the faint hum of the generator and the pop of the firewood. I fell asleep wrapped in my sleeping bag, the smell of smoke in my hair. The second night was colder. You could feel it creeping through the gaps in the cabin walls. The wind outside wasn't steady. It came in short, uneven gusts that rattled the tin roof. I woke up around 2 a.m. without knowing why. The lantern had burned out, leaving the cabin pitch black except for the dull red glow from the wood stove. My breath was visible in the beam of my flashlight as I reached over to check my phone. No signal. At first I just listened. There was the wind again, scraping across the roof and sighing through the trees. Then I heard something else. Boots crunching outside, moving slowly around the cabin. The steps were steady but not rushed, like someone pacing. I figured it was Matt, maybe going to the outhouse again. But the sound didn't fade away. It circled. I waited, holding my breath, thinking maybe he was checking something near the generator. Then I heard another set of steps, heavier, closer. I sat up, heart pounding. The floorboards were cold under my feet as I pulled on my jacket and reached for my flashlight. The beam caught dust floating in the air. The crunching outside stopped for a moment, then started again, slower this time. I walked to the window beside the door and angled the flashlight through the glass. What I saw froze me. About 20 feet out near the tree line, two bright orange vests glowed faintly in the dark. They stood side by side, motionless, facing the woods. Not facing the cabin, facing away like they were watching something out there. I couldn't see their faces, just the orange and a bit of reflection off what might have been a rifle barrel. I waited for them to move, thinking maybe it was Matt and someone else he'd met scouting. But they didn't move. They didn't talk. They just stood there in complete silence. My hand shook as I turned off the flashlight. Through the window, I could still faintly make out the orange shapes against the black trees. They stayed there for what felt like forever, maybe a minute. Then one of them turned, slowly, and walked deeper into the woods. The other never moved. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear twigs snap. Just silence again, except for the wind that came and went. I backed away from the window, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Matt was asleep in the loft above me, and I thought about waking him, but something in me said not to. I couldn't explain why. I just sat in the dark for hours, barely moving, listening for the sound of those boots again. When the first gray light came through the cracks in the walls, I finally stood up and looked outside again. Nothing. The trees were still, the frost covering the ground like a thin layer of glass. When Matt climbed down from the loft, I told him what I'd seen. He looked at me for a moment, then said he'd go check it out. He pulled on his boots and jacket, grabbed his rifle, and stepped outside. I stood in the doorway watching him walk toward the spot I'd seen the vests. The ground crunched under his boots, leaving clear prints in the frost. He looked around for a few minutes, crouched, then waved me over. When I got there, I saw the tracks. Deep, clear boot prints leading from the side of the cabin toward the trees. But there was only one set. I could see exactly where the person had been standing, where they turned, and where they walked away. No second set beside it. No marks from another person. Just one. Matt didn't say much. He followed the prints a little way into the woods before they faded into harder ground. When he came back, he said it was probably a hunter cutting through the property, maybe checking a trail in the dark. But the way his voice sounded told me he didn't really believe that. We didn't talk much the rest of the day. He spent most of it inside, cleaning his rifle and checking his trail cameras. When evening came, he suggested we shut off the generator early to save fuel. The cabin fell completely silent except for the wind. I couldn't shake the image of those two orange vests, one standing still, the other turning away without a sound. Later that afternoon, Matt brought in one of the trail camera cards to check. He had a small laptop he used for it. I remember him frowning as he clicked through the images, most of them showing deer, raccoons, or empty shots triggered by the wind. Then he paused. He didn't say anything, but I leaned over and looked at the screen. The picture showed the clearing behind the cabin. Taken just before 2 a.m., two orange figures stood there, exactly where I'd seen them. One was clear, facing the woods. The other was faint, almost transparent, like it had been caught mid-step. But there was no face, no headlight, no shape of a gun. Just the vest. He deleted the photo right away and shut the laptop without a word. That night he slept with his rifle beside his bed. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the uneven wind scrape across the cabin walls. I didn't hear footsteps again, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those vests glowing faintly in the dark, facing the trees like they were waiting for something to come out. When I left the next morning, I looked back once before getting in my truck. The frost had melted off the ground, but I could still see a faint trail of disturbed leaves leading from the cabin into the woods. I don't know who it was out there, or why there was only one set of prints, but every November since, whenever the wind comes in slow, broken bursts, I think about that night in the woods near Ashland. The quiet, the cold, and the two orange vests that never should have been there. It was early November when I decided to hike the Timberline Trail. The air had that sharp, dry chill that comes right before winter sets in, and most people had already packed up their gear for the season. That was part of the reason I went. I wanted the quiet. No crowds, no noise, just the sound of wind moving through trees and the crunch of my boots on frozen dirt. I had some time off work and figured I'd do the full loop, or at least as much as weather would allow. I parked at a small pullout on the west side of the trail around mid-morning. There were no other cars, which didn't surprise me. A few patches of snow clung to the shadowed parts of the ground, and the air smelled faintly like pine and wet soil. I strapped on my pack, adjusted the straps until the weight felt centered, and started up the trail. The first few hours were calm. The ground alternated between damp dirt and thin ice cracking lightly under my boots. Every breath hung in the air for a second before fading away. I passed through sections of tall evergreens, their needles whispering softly above, and open areas where the wind came strong off the mountain. There was a sense of stillness everywhere. No birds, no animals moving through brush, just the steady rhythm of my steps. It was maybe mid-afternoon when I noticed the footprints. They appeared suddenly, as if whoever made them had started right from that point. The snow wasn't deep, but it was enough to hold shape, and the prints were fresh. Edges sharp, no signs of melting or distortion. They were a little larger than mine, from someone wearing heavier boots. I figured it could be another hiker heading the same direction. Maybe someone else who liked solitude too. But what caught my attention was how every few hundred yards, the prints would pause, turn slightly sideways, and then continue. It was subtle, but it looked like the person had been stopping to look behind them. At first, I didn't think much of it. People stop to check maps, take breaks, maybe look around. Still, something about those repeated turns made me uneasy. I didn't see anyone ahead, even though the trail was open for long stretches. The snow was too fresh for those prints to have been made long before I got there. They couldn't have been more than an hour old. By late afternoon, the light began to thin. The trees cast long shadows over the trail, and the wind had that colder edge that means night isn't far away. Around then, I stopped near a small creek to refill my water bottle and rest a bit. The creek was partly frozen along the edges, water moving sluggishly under thin sheets of ice. As I crouched down to scoop water, something caught my eye on the slope above the opposite bank. A person standing still, maybe 100 yards uphill. They wore a brown jacket, the kind of heavy canvas type people use for work or hunting, and dark pants. They weren't moving at all, just standing there facing in my direction. I straightened up and raised a hand, half to wave, half to show I saw them. There was no reaction, no movement at all. They just stood there unmoving in that same spot. I waited for a few seconds, thinking maybe they didn't notice me. But the longer I looked, the stranger it felt. I couldn't make out their face because of the distance and the way the light was fading. But something about the stillness seemed wrong. After a minute or two, I just turned back to the trail. When I glanced up again before leaving, the person was gone. I tried not to dwell on it. It could have been a hunter or another hiker checking their bearings. Still, that sense of being watched stayed with me as I moved higher into the ridge area. The sky turned darker blue, then gray, and by the time I found a decent flat spot to set up camp, it was close to evening. I chose a spot a little off the main trail, sheltered by a few trees but still open enough to see the stars. I pitched my small one-person tent, boiled water for a simple meal, and crawled into my sleeping bag as the temperature dropped fast. The woods at night in the off-season feel different. The air feels heavier, sounds carry farther, and you notice every little movement outside your tent. The wind would come in low gusts, moving the tent fabric just enough to make soft rustling sounds. I drifted off around 10 p.m., my breath fogging up inside the tent, the world completely silent. I woke up sometime after 1 a.m. It wasn't from a dream or cold. It was a sound. A slow, rhythmic crunch of snow outside the tent. It wasn't wind or tree branches falling. It was distinct footsteps. They were close. Too close. Just a few feet away, circling slowly around one side of the tent. I lay completely still, my heartbeat thudding hard in my chest. The sound moved halfway around, then stopped. Silence. Then a faint shifting sound like someone stepping carefully, trying not to make noise. I wanted to look out, but I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent. For a long minute, there was nothing. Then I heard the crunch again. Fainter this time, moving away, back toward the direction of the trail. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to every sound, waiting for it to come back. Never did. When the first light came, I got out of the tent quickly. My breath hung thick in the cold morning air, and the ground had a thin new layer of snow that had fallen overnight. I looked around the campsite. There were no footprints near the tent. None. Just a clean, unbroken surface of fresh snow, except for my own steps from last night leading to the creek and back. But just a few yards beyond that, near where the trail met the ridge, there was a single line of fresh prints, those same large boot prints from before, leading back the way I had come. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. It made no sense. If someone had been walking around my tent, there should have been signs in the snow. But there was nothing, Only the new trail of prints, like whoever had been out there had turned around before dawn and walked away. I packed up fast. My fingers were stiff from the cold, and my hands shook as I stuffed the tent into its sack. I kept looking around, half expecting to see that brown jacket somewhere between the trees. The woods were silent again, too silent. On the hike back down, I saw those footprints for miles. Same direction, same pattern, occasional sideways turns as if whoever made them kept checking behind. I followed them all the way down until they eventually faded, where the snow ended near the trailhead. My car was still there, untouched, the only vehicle in the lot. I got inside and sat for a while with the heater running, staring at the empty pullout and the start of the trail behind me. I thought about that person standing on the slope, the sound circling my tent, the prints leading away. Could have been another hiker, sure. Maybe someone just as nervous about me as I was about them. But something about it didn't feel like that. It felt like whoever it was had been there long before I arrived. Watching, waiting, turning back again and again, making sure they weren't the ones being followed. As I drove off, I caught one last glimpse of the trail through the trees. Snow was falling again, lightly this time, covering everything in white. By the time anyone else came through that part of timberline, the footprints, mine and theirs, would be gone. Just empty woods, silent and clean, as if neither of us had ever been there at all.